Hey, good afternoon, everybody. This is Josh Raymond. I'm co-chair of the Legislative and Policy Group here at Venable Law Firm. I've got a team of lawyers and government affairs professionals on with me, Allison Baker, Len Gordon, and Chase Burgess. All of us work on consumer protection issues, especially around financial products. Today we're going to go over kind of how we see the world of consumer protection shaking out in light of what now appears to be pretty definitive election results. I'm going to go over really quickly, just kind of lay the land where we are today with the election, and then we're going to move very quickly into some of the policy areas. And I'm also going to apologize. We uploaded the slides, I think, a day or two ago, so with things changing so fast, there might be a little bit of outdatedness to some of these, even in the past 24 hours. But as you all probably know, every major media outlet has declared that Joe Biden is going to be president-elect. We have him actually at 290 with Arizona called by the rest of the media outlets last night. AP and Fox did it election night or the day after the election. If you throw Georgia in there, which seems to, one would think would not be affected by a recount, you're up at 306. With that, what is uncalled is the Senate. As most people know, we have a tight Senate race in Georgia with two runoffs. The Democrats would have to win both of those runoffs to get to a 50-50 Senate. That would be a tiebreaker with Vice President-elect Harris having to break any ties. We're not necessarily election prognosticators here at Venable, but I think most of us do think that the Democrats have an uphill battle in both of those races. If you look at the amount of votes that Biden got over the Democratic nominee, I think in the Ossoff race, Ossoff got 100,000 less votes than Biden got. And what I think we saw from a lot of these elections is that those Republicans that cast a vote for Biden as an anti-Trump vote then went down and reverted to form for Republicans. We will see. Both sides are very energized. It is going to be a very vigorously contested race on both sides with a tremendous amount of money, surrogates, resources all flowing into Georgia. I would hate to be a television watcher there right now. I've already seen some of the ads that have gone up, and they're all pretty harsh, and I think they'll be ubiquitous. So we are looking at a 52-48, 51-49 Republican majority, even at a 50-50. We think that still is a bit of a recipe for gridlock in the Senate. We don't see what some of the fears that a lot of folks had, that if the Democrats were to get the majority, you would eliminate a filibuster and essentially have a kind of free-reign Democratic rule in the Congress. I think Joe Manchin's already said he would vote against it. I think Kirsten Sinema from Arizona might also. And so I think what that means for our purposes, and let me just move forward on slides here, but what that means for our purposes is that we really believe that the issues that the going to be driving consumer regulation, product regulation, financial regulation, be very much at the agency level. Now, it's worth noting here that we would not have necessarily been saying something had the results been different. A lot of this regulation, a lot of the policy in this area is set at agencies like the CFPB, like the Federal Trade Commission. Congress has often had a tough time coming together since Dodd-Frank to pass serious consumer protection legislation. That's not to say it wouldn't have happened had there been a 51 or 52 seat Senate Democrat majority, but it still would have been very tough. But what we're going to talk through in this presentation, I think, is and emphasize is that the regulators really will have a fair amount to say in this, and Congress, I think, is going to have a bit of a backseat to a lot of this. As a kind of prelude to all that, I think it's really worth noting, looking at some of the transition folks that have been named. You have or people who are on the transition teams. You have people that we know were there for Dodd-Frank and were there for other consumer laws that are back in this transition. I would point to somebody like Michael Barr, who, along with Elizabeth Warren, was really the driver of the of a lot of the legislation and ideas behind the Consumer Financial Trade, the CFPB, and he's back on the transition team. That doesn't necessarily mean he will take a position in the administration, but you can see kind of where they're going with some of these appointments. Gary Gensler, on the financial regulatory side, is heading over all the supervisory Fed Treasury kind of transition. And Gary, like Michael Barr, was there at the very beginning of Dodd-Frank, is a sort of Dodd-Frank purist, will drive policy in a way that kind of reverts back to where things were in 2012 and 2013 and 14, vis-a-vis kind of a strict adherence and enforcement to Dodd-Frank rules and regulations. So it will take time to sort of undo some of the things that were done this year, but I think it's worth noting that even just in this transition time, that just some of the people, the names we're seeing are strong consumer advocates, strong advocates of consumer rules and regs that we saw during the Obama registration, the authors of them in many cases, and so I think you can kind of see a direction. That said, I'd like to turn it over to Allison to just start to talk a little bit about how she sees the CFPB. Allison, you can introduce yourself a bit, but Allison's a former CFPB attorney and was there from the very beginning and has real insights on not just the agency over the last few years, but its founding, and probably can talk a little bit about some of the people that might be coming back in and how they might see the agency going forward. So Allison, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Josh. Good afternoon. I'm Allison Baker, Chair of Venables Financial Services Practice, and I wanted to speak briefly today about the CFPB and what we expect in a Biden administration. Obviously, a lot hinges on whether or not the Democrats control the Senate, to the extent that if they do, of course, the likely director of the CFPB will probably be somebody who is able to be quite a bit more aggressive in making an agenda than if the Democrats don't control the Senate. In all likelihood, the person who gets named as director of the Bureau and gets confirmed will be somebody who probably still shares a lot of the ideas of the Biden team, but may not be somebody who's as aligned with certain wings of the party, if you will. But having said all of that, I think it goes without saying that there's a lot of focus on the CFPB. It's one of the agencies that's called out specifically in the transition plan. And I think that that's noteworthy because there's a sense that in the last few years, the CFPB hasn't been as aggressive, certainly in enforcement in general, and then specifically around certain areas. There's really a few that come to mind. Of course, small dollar lending or payday lending. Everybody knows that there was a rule that was proposed under Rich Cordray. That rule got pulled back by Mulvaney and Kraninger and then got reintroduced by Kraninger. And one of the notable things that was removed from the version that was reintroduced is an ability to pay analysis that a lot of consumer advocates have been arguing about and agitating and advocating for a long time. In a nutshell, it's the idea that if you make a small dollar short-term loan to a consumer, there is some underwriting around that consumer's ability to repay that loan that needs to happen. And that's been a push and pull for folks in the industry, and it's been a push and pull for consumer advocates. And there's a lot of people at the CFPB who are still there and who've been there since the very beginning, who are longtime believers that it's really important to have a payday rule that reflects an ability to pay regime. So I think you can expect that will get resurfaced. Before I go through some other points, there's a couple of really noteworthy things that I think are important to keep in mind. A lot of the people at the CFPB who are senior and who've made policy at the Bureau have been at the Bureau since 2011 when the CFPB came online. So the agency was created as part of the Dodd-Frank Act. It was established under the Dodd-Frank Act in 2010. But of course, it came online in July of 2011, and the months immediately leading up to 2011, in July of 2011, it was staffed by a lot of people, including Michael Barr and others who, Michael Barr is not at the Bureau any longer, but to Josh's point, he's on one of the transition teams, but others are still at the Bureau. Peggy Tuig, who runs the Office of Supervision Policy, Patrice Ficklin, who was there at the beginning as well, who runs Fair Lending. These individuals are very senior at the CFPB, and they've been there for the long haul. And I expect that their ideas are going to really, they're going to have a lot of sway and influence over the future of the Bureau, especially if there is some inability to get through initially a director of Biden's choosing in the Senate. And so with that in mind, I think the other thing you're going to see a real uptick in is fair lending review and enforcement. Over the last few years, we haven't seen a lot of fair lending review in the supervision world or in the enforcement world. Indeed, I don't think there's been any real fair lending cases brought or matters settled. And I think you're going to see a real uptick in that engagement. I think the Office of Fair Lending is going to get pushed out of the director's office and brought back into its own place where it was at the beginning as part of the supervision and enforcement regime. And I think you're going to see a real uptick in Equal Credit Opportunity Act queries. You're going to see a real interest in HMDA, which is the Home Mortgage Disclosure Act, and the requirements that companies that underwrite mortgages and provide mortgages provide that information to the Fed. You're going to see a lot of really deliberate actions around whether or not there's been disparate impact in the lending space. I think that that is going to be a big difference between a Biden administration and a Trump administration. I think you might see an interest in continuing to review and look at the way collections efforts are undertaken, especially with the new debt collection rule that just came out a couple of weeks ago. I think you're going to continue to see an interest in credit reporting. Of course, if you look at the Democratic platform, one of the proposals in it is the idea of there being a public credit reporting agency, presumably one that would be managed in some way by the CFPB. I don't know candidly how much traction that's going to get. But I do know it's a conversation that's being had because there is an intense interest in credit reporting, both in terms of how it's undertaken, but also, of course, as a mechanism to enable more and enlarge access to credit. And these are ideas that continue to animate all of the people who are at the Bureau in senior positions and who were there at the beginning, but also some of the folks who are going to likely come in either as part of the transition or come into through the Biden administration or both. And indeed, when you look at the transition team for the CFPB, it's comprised of people, many of whom have been at the Bureau at different points in time over the last 5 years or so. And I think you're going to see some of that influence come back in to the agency. I also think you're going to see an uptick in enforcement activity. That almost goes without saying. There's been a lot of scrutiny around, the last few years of enforcement activity, and I've seen some statistics that suggest that there's been a real precipitous decline, certainly in fees assessed, penalties assessed, and restitution. And I think you're definitely going to see a reverse of that, regardless of who ends up running the agency, even if it's an interim director. I think some of the other things to just keep an eye on are the role and interaction between supervision and enforcement. A few weeks ago, there was a memo that came out that suggested that the Office of Supervision Policy would be overseeing enforcement on a go forward, akin to or similar to what the prudential regulators do. And there was a 6-month timeline for installing that new structure at the Bureau. I don't expect that is going to happen under a Biden administration. I think you'll continue to see enforcement and supervision be co-equals in the org chart. And I think you'll continue to see this dynamic between them where sometimes something isn't clearly in supervision's bucket or clearly in enforcement's bucket. And I think that dynamic will continue to be a big issue as we move forward, both in a way that maybe engages enforcement more, but also in a way that might engage supervision more. So those are some of the high level things that I'm looking at and I'm expecting. And of course, the favorite conversation in DC whenever there's an election is who's going to run this and who's going to run that. And I don't even want to speculate at this moment because until we have a clearer picture of the Senate, I think it's premature. But suffice to say, you will see somebody who is engaged on fair lending. You'll see somebody who's engaged on payday lending. I think you'll see somebody who's engaged around some of the issues in the credit reporting space. And I think as a structural matter, you'll see somebody who's committed to having more aggressive and more in quantity numbers of enforcement actions that come out of the CFPB. you know, I think we should all just stay tuned and see what happens over the next few months. Well, thank you. And Josh, I think that I know you wanted to talk briefly about some of the prudential banking issues as well.
Well,
so I'll turn it back
I wanted
to you.
well, just before we go, Allison, I did want to, as a congressional watcher, and I know we've talked a little bit about this, but you know, at least my own speculation that with the Republicans maintaining control, that it could be hard to get a director confirmed, and that's my speculation, not yours. But in that case, do you see it? Would you see if we were back into an acting position? Would you see that as significantly hampering the ability for the Bureau to move forward? And I know that's a somewhat unanswerable question, but people.
So I've given some thought to this, you know, and it would obviously depend on who the acting director is. You know, I'm not super ensconced in the Vacancy Act, but I understand that there's a number of people it could be, and I think candidly it depends on who it is. As I said, there's a number of very senior career people at the CFPB who were there at the very beginning, who were brought in by Elizabeth Warren, by Rich Cordray, by Barack Obama in the case of Patrice Ficklin, whose instincts and values and sensibilities really track, you know, kind of the founding fathers and mothers of the agency. And if one of those people is the acting director of the Bureau, I'm not sure you're going to see a significant hampering of an agenda. I think if it's somebody who maybe isn't part of that founding sensibility, you may see more of a hampering of this agenda. But I suspect that, you know, given the possibility, and I think it's a real possibility, that Biden isn't able to get his first choice director through readily, I think what you'll see is probably a very deliberate selection of somebody under the Vacancy Act who can readily run the agency and probably execute on a lot of these ideas that have been around for a long time. You know, people have been waiting in the wings in the consumer finance community and the consumer protection community for the last 3 years, talking about what needs to change and, you know, kind of continue the Cordray legacy. And I don't think that's, I think if you have an acting director, you may see that. I think it all depends on who the person is. But there's a number of candidates for that role who I think could readily continue that Cordray Warren legacy without really missing a beat.
Okay. Yeah, the only thing I wanted to mention on the consumer side, I think, before we move to Len, is thinking about some of the proposals that are live right now and that have been talked about. I think, Alice, you mentioned sort of a public utility kind of setup for credit bureaus. I think, you know, we see that as without a clear majority in the Senate for Democrats, a pretty difficult thing to do, but we could still see where the CFPB would start to push on that. There's also been a lot of talking about universal banking and universal banking accounts and essentially giving free banking to consumers. I think the only way that happens at this point would be through a Federal Reserve action, which I think we're very far away from, and just in terms of how quickly the Fed moves and how controversial Fed now accounts would be. I think the other thing to be watching for, at least for the financial institutions on this, on the call from a consumer perspective, is what happens to the Community Investment Act. I think folks know that the OCC has finalized a proposal that's really been pretty widely criticized by both consumer advocates and a lot of the banks that will have to adhere to it. And the Fed, under the leadership of Lael Brainerd, has put out an advance notice of proposed rulemaking. And the FDIC is sitting somewhere right in the middle with the FDIC Republican-appointed director, Yelena McWilliams, having said that she is going to stick around to finish her term, which is another 2 years. So the CRA rule is, I think, still very much in flux, but I would expect the OCC director to be replaced fairly quickly, given that Brian Brooks is an acting director and not likely to be confirmed. I would imagine that we will undergo a revision of that rule, which of course will take time, and we'll somehow sync that up to Lael Brainerd's proposal, and then hopefully, I guess, bring the FDIC in so we can have one standard there. But clearly, it will become a rule in many ways that will sort of do more to steer investment to minority communities, at least from a public advocate's perspective, than the current one will. So I would kind of expect that rule to kind of move leftward. But also there's a lot of technical issues that banks have raised that they'd like to see fixed, and I think there's going to be opportunities to weigh in through the ANPR process there. So those are some other consumer-related issues that I would just wanted to highlight before we move along to Len to talk about the FTC, where, of course, I think given the discussion we just had about possible moving around under Vacancies Act, there could be some changes there as well. So and some interplay between the CFPB and the FTC, which is why we wanted to make sure we had Len on the call as well. So Len, I will hand this over to you.
Thank you very much, Josh. Great job from both you and Allison. So, as with every agency, a lot of tumult and a little bit of a cloudy crystal ball figuring out exactly what's going to happen with the FTC. The transition team for the FTC is headed by Heather Hipsley, who spent, I think, 35 years at the agency, a lot of that in the Advertising Practices Division, also at the General Counsel's Office, sort of as a consummate FTC career lawyer, very bright, very nice woman. So I think she'll bring sort of historical institutional perspective to the transition team. The other leader of the team is Professor Laura Moy from Georgetown, who is a privacy maven or guru, and obviously that's a huge part of the FTC's mission, and I think it's a growing part. So I think as you would expect, privacy will continue to be an important part of the FTC's agenda in a Biden administration. A large part of what happens with the FTC will be decided not in Congress or at the FTC in the short term, but at the Supreme Court. For the last 30 years, the vast majority of cases that the FTC has brought, they've brought in federal court pursuant to Section 13B of the FTC Act, which authorizes the FTC to get an injunction in proper cases. And over time, the FTC has taken that grant of the power to get an injunction and convinced courts that with that power comes a full panoply of other equitable remedies, including equitable monetary remedies such as restitution and disgorgement. And the FTC has gotten ever more aggressive in exercising that power, seeking restitution or disgorgement based on gross proceeds, imposing it against individuals, imposing it against service providers on a joint and several basis. That the issue of whether injunction means injunction or injunction means this raft of other equitable remedies is squarely before the Supreme Court. There were two cases there, one from the Seventh Circuit, which had overturned existing precedents and said, no, injunction means injunction. These prior cases that have implied these other powers were based on old Supreme Court precedents that we don't think is good anymore. If you look at the entire panoply of things that are in the FTC Act, it's clear that if the Congress had meant to give the FTC this other power in Section 13B, it would have been more explicit. There's also a case from the Ninth Circuit that affirmed sort of the traditional FTC-friendly view. But both of those cases were up at the Supreme Court. In the last week, the Supreme Court, without now Justice Barrett participating, sent the Seventh Circuit case back to the Seventh Circuit because then Judge Barrett had been at the Seventh Circuit when the case overturning an existing Seventh Circuit decision had been rendered, and because it was overturning existing Seventh Circuit precedent, the case was circulated for a potential rehearing en banc, and she was one of the judges who voted on that. So because she had essentially participated in that case, she would not have been able to participate in it if it went to the Supreme Court. So now they sent that back. I think Justice Barrett's arrival to Supreme Court is a favorable development for those who think the FTC went too far. She's a strict constructionist. She's issued some opinions on other federal statutes that were very narrow in their construction. So we'll see. But if that happens, what the FTC does and how it does it may change directly. And the FTC has already written to Congress asking them to fix what they think is going to happen at the Supreme Court. All five commissioners, the three Republicans, the two Democrats, signed that letter a few weeks ago. But whether that's going to happen and how quickly that happens it remains to be seen. When the FTC got its power under Section 13B, it got it as part of the Trans-Alaska Pipeline Act. It was sort of stuck on to another piece of legislation, and if the FTC is to get a fix for the 13B problem, it may be in that vein. Another big legislative issue for the Commission may be potential privacy legislation, including the ability to get civil penalties directly for either privacy or data security violations. When you think about civil penalties for data breaches, it's a little terrifying. If even if the civil penalty is only $1,000, and it likely could be more, and you're talking about millions and millions of records being hacked, the consequences for industry could be severe. So whether that legislation gets enacted and whether the FTC has civil penalty authority under it remains to be seen. So, I think we all expect that at some point you'll have a Democratic chairman. Who that's going to be is unclear. Whether, the president in the waning days of his administration appoints a new Republican chairman is possible. There's a lot of rumor out there that he's not happy with the current chairman, Joe Simons. I have no inside information on that. I know what I read in Politico and other places. But, we've seen what's happened at other departments and agencies with reshuffling of the deck chairs, and that's certainly not out of the question. So, we'll have to see. One of the existing commissioners, Rohit Chopra, has been very vocal in throughout his term, but especially in the last year, in dissents, articles, speeches, concurring statements, criticizing some of the current actions and policies and priorities and ordering of priorities of the FTC, and outlining what he thinks the agency ought to be doing. And whether or not he's the chairman, I think taking a quick look at those gives us an idea of what some priorities might be. So Commissioner Chopra has put out papers in the last month, two different ones that talk about the FTC dusting off tools that Congress gave it that the FTC hasn't used. The first is the FTC's power under the Magnuson-Moss Act to enact regulations that define what is a deceptive act or practice. And the FTC has been loath to do that because the rulemaking process that is outlined in that statute is cumbersome. It provides for hearings, it provides for cross-examination of witnesses, it requires for a practice to be described as, be proscribed as unfair or deceptive. It has to be found to be prevalent. It would be an administrative lawyer's dream because there's lots of tests and hoops that the agency has to jump through. But Commissioner Chopra has posited that the agency ought to dust that off, and then once it does that, it can use its authority under Section 19 to get civil penalties directly. It doesn't have to refer those actions to the Justice Department as it does for other civil penalty actions, and start really penalizing bad actors. He's included in his support for this proposal that those rules might include liability not just for direct actors, but for others who facilitate deceptive acts or practices, such as payment processors or others who are service providers. So again, whether that action, whether he or another Democrat is chairman, remains to be seen. If they can't get relief from either the Supreme Court or Congress to bolster their 13B authority, I suppose that's something they could do, but I think it will be difficult. The other idea that Commissioner Chopra has recently circulated is to use the FTC's consent authority, order authority. So the FTC Act actually provides that if the FTC gets a cease and desist order against Allison for doing something, and I have knowledge of that cease and desist order, it has to be a litigated order, and I engage in the same act or practice, the FTC can sue me in federal court for civil penalties for conducting an act or practice which I knew was illegal. Now, again, he thinks this is another way to create better deterrence and punish bad actors and perhaps fill in the gap in their Section 13 authority. I think he underestimates the scope and the time commitment in administrative litigation, how difficult it may be to prove that what Allison was doing and what I were doing were the same. But he is clearly thinking creatively about how to use the tools Congress has already given the FTC to perhaps fill the gap in its authority if Section 13B is vitiated. He's also written on a host of other issues that he thinks ought to be priorities for the FTC and perhaps a reordering of priorities. He's written that the FTC ought to use its Section 5 unfairness authority to challenge discriminatory practices under the Fair Housing Act. He's written a lot about dark patterns, which are tricks that supposedly manipulate consumers when viewing web pages so that they don't see disclaimers. Essentially, even though a web page may have a clear disclaimer, there's some that think that there are tricks that marketers can use to avert or to misdirect the viewer's eyes from those disclosures, so that even though it plainly says on a page that something's you're going to have a recurring billing or you're going to be charged if you don't act, it's not clear because these dark patterns somehow misdirect people's eyes. And he's a big believer in that. And as someone who has to counsel clients on how to disclose things, that school of thought poses a real challenge. He's written about warranty issues. He's very focused, and I think the commission will remain focused on small business lending. They had a workshop on that this year. They've brought a couple cases against merchant cash advance companies. I think you'll see more there. I mean, the merchant cash advance space is a space that's not regulated heavily, so I think the FTC views there being a void there, and so I think you will continue to see a lot of activity there. He's pushed for the FTC to use the authority given to it under Dodd-Frank auto loans more vigorously. I think you will see that. I've talked about privacy. He thinks there should be even more assets and resources directed towards privacy. And he's talked generally about rearranging and reprioritizing the structure of the FTC and how resources are deployed to try and get better bang for the buck. The FTC is constantly feels like they're playing whack-a-mole, where they're going after marketers who are doing things illegally. And from time to time, whether it's called Operation Choke Point or other things, the FTC thinks about ways to change the ecosystem in which they believe fraud breeds to choke it off. And I think you'll see even more of that under a Democratic administration, especially if it's led by Commissioner Chopra. Before I forget, for those of you who need CLE, the secret word is consumer. Once again, the CLE secret word is consumer. I made a joke as we were getting started that means the duck comes down, but no one remembers Groucho Marx's old show at this point, so we'll keep going. The FTC also obviously has a big role in antitrust, and I think actually the difference between a Republican administration and a Democratic administration may be greater here. There is an investigation going on of Facebook. It's reported almost daily in the papers as to what's going to happen. I think that will clearly continue in a Democratic administration. Mergers in the pharmaceutical space. I mean, the FTC has for years had a playbook where they require companies to divest the drugs where there's an overlap. And Commissioner Chopra has written repeatedly that this paradigm that the FTC follows does not work. And he believes that merger enforcement needs to be a tool to fix what he believes are problems in the way drugs are priced and really use that to leverage wholesale change in drug pricing. The Republicans on the commission have resisted that. Whether in a new administration that happens, it remains to be seen, but it's a very aggressive view, and it's a really different view than Republicans historically have taken on that. And just a merger enforcement generally, I think Commissioner Chopra and other Democrats are much more skeptical of the efficiencies and benefits of mergers, and whether they do that through trying to work with the Hill, especially the House, to enact different tests for perhaps mergers in high-tech markets, maybe it's assessing conduct in high-tech markets by single firm actors, but there's a lot of thought on the Democratic side of the aisle that antitrust needs to get fixed and that it's not working to adequately deal with high-tech markets. That's a recurring theme over the last 30 years in antitrust, but it seems to be getting greater traction, and even some on the Republican side of the aisle. So we'll see. I think the other area on the antitrust side, this is another pet project of Commissioner Chopra, is the Packers and Stockyard Act and USDA regulations, which are meant to protect farmers. He's urged repeatedly for bright lines and more rigorous enforcement there. Well, again, that's not really the FTC's job, but he has been a forceful advocate for that, and I think that will continue. Excuse me. With that, I think we're turning it open to questions if folks have any. Any questions?
All right.
Josh or Allison, anything further?
No, I think that's. Go ahead, Allison.
I was going to talk a little bit more about kind of the interplay between the FTC and the CFPB in light of some of the comments Len's made, and kind of how I think you might think about those agencies, maybe working a little bit more closely together in a Biden administration. I don't think we've seen as much coordination in the last few years between them, because candidly, I think the CFPB has been a little bit more restrained in the consumer protection space and its mandate than the FTC has been. And so I think there's been less collaboration. And one of the things that I do expect, apropos of this discussion and of Rohit Chopra in particular, who before he was at the FTC, he was the founding ombudsperson for the student loan ombuds role at the CFPB. So he's an Elizabeth Warren ally, and was somebody who worked closely with her on developing the student loan aspects of the Bureau, and then went to do some other things, and then got appointed as a commissioner of the FTC. But the reason I bring all of this up is historically, at the beginning of the Bureau's time, there was a lot of collaboration and cross-pollination with the FTC. There's rules that say that if the FTC is investigating a non-bank, the CFPB can't pursue the same investigation. But there have been historically sweeps that both agencies conduct together. When I was at the Bureau, I know we participated in those, and I expect that under a Biden administration, even if there isn't a Biden-confirmed director of the CFPB, you'll see more of that kind of collaboration between those two agencies, especially if Rohit Chopra is the chairman of the FTC, or if he comes and becomes an acting or actual director of the CFPB. But in either event, I do think you'll see that. And I think you'll see, in particular, a lot of collaboration around certain areas that the two agencies really share, not just as a legal matter, but as a policy matter, including credit reporting. And so that's something else to be watching out for as we move forward. There is a certain amount of uncertainty, of course, around the leadership of these institutions until we know more about the Senate. But I don't think the agenda will change that much, even if the leadership's a little less certain at the moment. I don't know, Len, what your thoughts are about that.
No, I think
I
think that's a very astute observation. I think the lack of coordination has probably been more a function of less rigorous or vigorous enforcement at the CFPB. I mean, yes. Frankly, the FTC, those of us who have to deal with them daily have expressed frustration that it's been very much like a Democratic administration, because Commissioner Chopra has such a strong presence. I think he has gotten his way on a lot of issues, and perhaps the chairman has tried to pacify him that, where on those consumer protection issues that are less dear to the chairman, to try and broker some unanimity or more unanimity on the antitrust issues, which are, I think, Chairman Simon's first love, and that's what he's done for his entire career. So I think that's a reflection of that. And I do think there'll be more coordination. The other issue that may happen here is if Commissioner Chopra goes to the CFPB, or if one of the commissioners resigns or does something else, goes to another government post, there's a chance you end up with a 2-2. You have 2 Ds, 2 Rs, which, the commission's had that several times recently, or even fewer, and it slows things down. It really can make someone who digs in their heels have an awful lot of power, which could be Commissioner Chopra. So we'll see. But, we in prior years when the commissioners were 2 Democrats, 2 Republicans, we had a case that died at the commission because neither side could, there was not 3 votes to issue a complaint, which ended up being a great result for our client. So we'll see.
Yeah, I think that's probably right, and I think your note that enforcement at the Bureau has been less aggressive and enforcement at the FTC has been more aggressive. I also think that's a function of who runs the Bureau of Consumer Protection, Andrew Smith, who's also been quite aggressive. I would say the most aggressive consumer financial protection agency in the last 3 years is the FTC. I do think that will change, though. I think the CFPB will once again become aggressive in that space. The other thing which we didn't mention on any of these slides, but we would be remiss to neglect here, is the role that the state attorneys general will continue to play in the consumer financial protection space. I will never forget that, January 20th was a Friday, but the very next Monday, which was, I guess, January 22nd or 23rd, we saw in court a huge uptick of state attorneys general lawsuits that were filed by certain, especially active AGs, in an effort to kind of stop or preempt or halt what was expected to be some Trump administration rollbacks. And you then saw for really the last 3 years a group of a handful of AGs, mostly in Democratic states, but not only the Democrats, become really a group of very aggressive enforcers of consumer finance laws. I don't think that's going to change. I think what you'll see is that work is done more closely in tandem with the CFPB, which historically has been at the beginning of the agency. Of course, its first director was a former attorney general. I think you will continue to see that consortium of Democratic attorneys general and some Republicans, enforce the consumer finance laws, both the CFPA itself, the Consumer Financial Protection Act, but also their own state laws, as aggressively as they've been doing during the Trump years. But I think you'll see the CFPB's enforcement office join forces more consistently in that effort. And so that is something to keep an eye on, not only more coordination with the Federal Trade Commission and its Bureau of Consumer Protection, but also a lot more coordination with the state attorneys general, which in many ways I think is actually going to result in a significant uptick in what is likely to be a pursuit of what I would call aggressive enforcement activity in the consumer finance space. So those are things we are keeping a very close eye on. And I think that in that vein, there continues to be a push and pull between the states and the federal government around some of those issues. And under Biden, I think you may see a more close alignment as we move forward.
Agreed.
Josh, I don't know if you have any other thoughts on, our prognostications as we look out into the future and try and see what the consumer protection and financial services spaces might look like. But I do think we're seeing trends that aren't necessarily going to hinge on who runs a particular agency alone.
Yeah, I think that's right, Allison, and nor on who necessarily runs Congress, but governors and administrations are going to be really important here. So, unless there are any other questions, I think we can wrap this up. Thanks everybody for joining, and you should have our contact information on the invitation, and so anybody's welcome to go ahead and shoot us a note separately. And I believe this will be made available for viewing later as well. So thank you all, and have a great weekend.
Thank you all.
Thank you. Bye.